Welcome to Torn, the only podcast committed to exposing the truth about the child welfare system and its devastating impact on families of color. Told from the perspective of your hosts, Sonia Johnson and Classie Collinette, two defense attorneys who have over 15 years of experience working in the child welfare system. Welcome again to FAM. Those of you that haven't listened to us yet here on Torn, the podcast with myself, Classie Collinette, and my sister-in-the-law, Sonia Johnson. We are here to welcome you. We're here for two main reasons. We want to give families that are involved in the child welfare system helpful information and insight about how to navigate the system. And we also want to empower families with information that's going to help them succeed. And then the second part of why we're here, it is to support advocates who are in this space called the child welfare system. We want to help you get the insight, background information, as well as helpful tips and tools that you can use in the work that you do every day. And this information is for everyone that is an advocate in some way in the system. So whether you are a parent defense attorney, whether you are an attorney representing the child welfare agency, whether you are working for a local nonprofit that works in these child welfare cases, whether you are a caseworker that works with families every day, we're here for each and every one of you. And I have dubbed each and every one of you FAM, because we're part of a big family. And my hope is that together we can empower families and support families. So I'm here again today with my sister-in-the-law, Sonia Johnson. Sonia, could you just give our wonderful listeners a shout out and tell them a little bit about really what brought you to this work first and foremost? And then we'll delve into our topic for today.
Well, thank you, Classie. Hello, fam. It's good to be with you all again. And as Classie indicated, we hope that the information that we are providing is informative and will be of assistance to you, whether you are entangled with the child welfare system or whether you are working with families to try and help them get through the child welfare system. And so today, I think we're going to talk a little bit about some of the cases that you and I generally work with during this work, or that we come across during this work.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about poverty is not abuse. And Sonia,
can you say that again? Can you say that again, Classie?
Yes. Let me say that for the folks in the back. Poverty is not abuse. And Sonia, this is something that permeates every one of our cases, because we know as parents, attorneys, that poor folks are always suspect. Everyone looks at poor people in a way that we don't look at people with resources, in a way that we don't look at individuals that live in nice neighborhoods. Everything, every little thing that poor people do is dissected. So, Sonia, let's talk a little bit about these misconceptions, because you and I both know that we've had cases that wouldn't be cases.
Right.
If the family did not live in a poor neighborhood. So tell us a little bit about some misconceptions that you have noticed in your work.
I'll share a story. So when I first started thinking about working in this area. A colleague came up to me and said, they're looking for attorneys to represent parents in child welfare cases. And I thought, child welfare? No, I mean, those parents did whatever they did. And hey, they need to deal with whatever brought them into the child welfare system. Then the colleague, kept saying, no, we really do need parent attorneys. And so finally I said, yes, I went to a training and got all of this wonderful training from the public defender's office. And then I started doing these cases. And I thought to myself, this is nothing like what I thought child welfare was about. When you think about child welfare, you think about the horrific stories that you hear about in the news. You think about the couple in California, the Turpin case that, kept their children locked in the home and chained up to beds. You think of those horrific stories. But the child welfare that we are involved in, the kind of cases that you and I see, are nothing like those cases. What we see are poor people caught in a system.
Mm-hmm.
I was astonished. And in fact, let me say it this way. The number of physical abuse cases that I've come across are very few. The number of sexual abuse cases that I've come across are very few. The majority of cases, am I right, Classie, fall under the title of neglect.
Absolutely.
And that's a broad category, right?
Yep.
So in your practice, now, like I said, I've been doing this for a while now. I think I've seen a handful of physical abuse cases, maybe a handful of sexual abuse cases.
Yeah, they're rare. They're rare. I mean, like you said, a handful.
The vast majority are neglect cases. And what's interesting is and I think this is nationwide, but certainly our state keeps records. Our child welfare agency keeps records. And if you go to their website and you look at maltreatment types, they will demonstrate for you exactly what we're saying. So I think in 2014 in our state, 10% of the cases involved were physical abuse cases. 7% were sexual abuse cases. Another 10% fell in the category of sort of multiple maltreatment types. But the vast majority, 73% of the cases reported were neglect cases. And that's certainly been true in my practice. Has that been true in your practice, Classie?
It has been. It has been. And with respect to the cases that are involving neglect, it is a fact that the cases that I have dealt with involving neglect, every one of those cases involved poor families that are vastly or mostly Black and brown. I will say that I have had experience representing poor white families as well, but most of my cases involve not just poor families, but Black and brown families as well.
Right. And Classie, neglect is such a broad term. Can you talk about what's included under the umbrella of neglect?
Yeah, so what's included in the umbrella of neglect really runs the gamut. It includes substance abuse, and substance abuse can be and has been most recently heroin, oxycodone, Oxycontin, as well as not so much anymore because our laws have changed in New Jersey, but marijuana, and also once in a while, I will have a case involving cocaine, but most of my substance abuse is the other substances that I mentioned.
But Classie, can we just go back to marijuana? Because, that's the thing that blew my mind, right? I'm standing in court representing a parent, trying to get a parent their children back. And their children have been removed because mom and dad are cannabis users. Now, as you said, that we're moving away from that, but it hasn't been that long since in this state, you could lose your child.
Yes.
Over marijuana.
Over marijuana. Absolutely, Sonia. And Sonia, this is on the backdrop today. You and I both know marijuana, also known as cannabis, that is a $1 billion industry.
Yup.
There are individuals making more money than anybody thought they could make with what was previously dubbed a drug that was against the law to use. And again, Sonia, as we sit here today, let us not also forget that the president of the United States, President Biden, who happens to be the president right now, he recently announced that he is giving a full and unconditional pardon of all prior federal offenses for simple possession of marijuana by United States citizens and lawful permanent residents.
Yep.
So not just on a local level in our state here in New Jersey, but on a national level, it has been recognized that marijuana use, and quite frankly, in this case, marijuana convictions, should be fully pardoned. And again, this is, of course, on a federal level from the president of the United States. So, of course, that is involving federal offenses. But that is just a reminder about the injustices that our clients who utilize and may utilize marijuana for recreational purposes have had to deal with loss of their children behind marijuana use. So, Sonia, you and I, we could do a whole episode just on, our clients who are parents and have had their children taken from them or had their parenting questioned and surveilled because of marijuana use. And the other types of cases that we see are mental health.
Right.
Many of our clients are dealing with things that many people who live in nice neighborhoods deal with: depression, whether it's postpartum depression, or maybe it's post-traumatic stress disorder, or another type of mental health concern. Also domestic violence. And again, when we talk about domestic violence, even our clients that are the quote unquote victims have had their children taken from them. I've had clients who are the quote unquote victim, and everyone agrees that they are a victim of domestic violence. They've had their children taken from them under the guise of, we're not sure that the children will be safe with your client, the victim, because we're not sure that your client is going to understand that the children cannot be around the alleged perpetrator. And we also want to make sure that your client, the alleged victim, is able to adequately parent. And here comes those parenting classes.
Sonia. Right. So,
and yeah,
this is a hot button for me because, a parent is experiencing domestic violence in the home, and then the state comes in and says, we don't think you can keep your kids safe. You just got beat up.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to remove your children. And we're going to make you take parenting classes. and we're going to make you take, domestic violence classes. And you're going to have to demonstrate to us that it's okay for you to parent your kids, that you can keep your kids safe. Not realizing the impact to the parent that has just been the victim of domestic violence, and not realizing the impact to the children who are, being removed from their parents. Because we can talk about the impact of the removals from children being removed from their parents. But so what I also think is really interesting, and I don't think people understand about domestic violence or about these neglect type offenses, is there hasn't been any harm to the children as of yet. But I digress. You were telling us about what falls under the category of neglect.
Yeah. So some more topics or issues that have come up in my cases, our cases, are inadequate supervision. And that's, in a nutshell, a parent leaving a kid home for a couple hours. Sometimes that's what that looks like with respect to inadequate supervision.
But
also, yes.
Can I just ask you this? So in inadequate supervision, does New Jersey set forth an age in which it's inappropriate to leave a child at home? Like, is there anything on the books that tells you that at this age, you shouldn't leave a kid at home?
I don't think so. Unless you know something that I don't know. I don't believe so.
No, I don't. So this inadequate supervision, can happen if you've got a 10-year-old and you leave them at home, right?
Right. Exactly.
And typically we find out about those cases because something causes that child to leave the home and garner the attention of somebody else. Right. 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 So it's not even that something has necessarily happened. Mm-hmm. It's just that the child has garnered the attention of somebody else. Maybe a neighbor knocked on the door and saw something and called the police. Right. Right. And then the police are responding to the home. The child may open the door and the police may say, "Where's mommy? Where's daddy?" And the kid may say, "I don't know." Next thing you know it, right? Right. That parent has been charged with child abuse in our state, right? Right.
Inadequate supervision. And by the way, Sonia, many times the kid is fine. Yep. I know I was one of those kids that went home by myself when I was in 6th grade. I would stay home a couple hours before my parents got home. And I knew how to make my food, do my homework. I was fine. There was no issue with that. But Sonia, I also recognize that I lived in the suburbs, and perhaps no one even thought to bother me, let alone knock on my door. And even if they did, I was always one of those kids that never opened the door anyway. But I think I venture to say, at least in my experience, my clients who don't live in the suburbs and live in underserved and under-resourced neighborhoods, again, folks want to surveil them a little bit more, and they are automatically suspect just because of where they live, as opposed to what actually has happened to that child, if anything at all.
Classie, I just want to piggyback, and maybe I'm dating myself. I was a latchkey kid, and that term was used, I think, in the 70s. Yeah, I'm definitely dating myself. But anyway, and like you, both me and my sister, we went to school at 3:00. We went home. We walked home by ourselves. Where we lived on the 10th floor. We took the elevator up, and I was responsible for letting me and my sister into our apartment. And I waited there until a parent came home. But I was responsible for, making, snacks or whatever for me and my sister. And we did our homework. We knew not to open the door because in our household, it was just like, you don't open that door for anybody. Right. Right. So, and we were fine. We were fine. And I grew up in New York City, and you could talk about all the things that could have happened to a child in New York City, but we were fine. And so the question that I have when I see these inadequate supervision cases is, would my parents have been subject to surveillance because they left us home or allowed us to be at home? And that reminds me, I wore the little key around my neck with a chain. So, but that they allowed us to be at home without an adult so that they can work and put food on the table. Because many of our clients, that's what they're trying to do. They're just trying to survive and live. So anyway, that's just, that's just my story about inadequate supervision. But anyway.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Sonia. I 100% understand and agree that many of us, even fam that's listening,
right?
I'm sure there are fam listening that have had this situation, right? They remember going home alone, and now it's like, really, that could have been a child welfare case,
right?
And again, Sonia, another type of case that we often deal with, and we talked about this earlier in our last episode, is homelessness,
right,
and inadequate housing, and all the perils that come with that. But again, go ahead.
Classie, can you just, because I think we all kind of understand what homelessness is, but what is inadequate housing?
Right. Yeah. So inadequate housing is a family, and I recently had a case like this. A family was living in an apartment that was owned by a slumlord. So everything that could go wrong was going wrong. The plumbing was not working appropriately. There were some windows that needed to be replaced. There was a rodent and a roach infestation. So in a nutshell, inadequate housing is subjective, but if I had to summarize it, it would be housing that we as individuals who live a middle-class lifestyle do not believe is appropriate. So it also could be housing that a family is about to lose. So sometimes a case comes to the attention of the Child Welfare Agency because a family is getting ready to be evicted, but they haven't quite gone through the legal process yet. So they may be able to stay in that apartment for another 6 or 7 months. But again, that's considered inadequate housing.
Okay.
So that's what it's looked like in my cases. What has it looked like for you in your cases?
I think I've seen the same thing, that it's a family that's on the verge of eviction. It hasn't quite happened yet, but it's going to happen. And like you said, inadequate housing is when our clients don't have the ability to afford a house that would meet the standards of a middle class lifestyle in this country. And so it's necessary, and they don't have the means and the ability to move someplace else. And so that's what I've also seen. But just in terms of these neglect types of cases, I mean, the other types of cases that I think you and I have both seen, medical neglect. And again, that's typically an issue where there is a need for some kind of medical intervention. And in cases that I've seen, it's the parent may not be able to necessarily afford that medical intervention. And have you seen something similar in terms of your medical neglect cases?
Yes, I have. And Sonia, many of my medical neglect cases are intertwined in many ways with lack of financial resources, because as we know, here in the United States, health insurance is typically tied to employment.
Right.
That's typically how most folks in the US acquire their health insurance. And so many of our clients are not fortunate enough to have employment that is steady or perhaps able to give them medical insurance or health insurance. And so they're not able many times to take their kids to the regular checkups. And that can also be looked at as medical neglect. And then some other types of cases that we often have to deal with are educational neglect, as well as child behavior. But Sonia, let's talk a little bit about what risk of harm versus actual harm looks like in our cases, because most of our cases, as we've already said, involve neglect.
So, Classie, you and I both know that there's this concept in child welfare that's called risk of harm. And that's when there hasn't actually been an actual harm perpetrated against the child or children involved, but the state is concerned about a risk of harm to the child. And so, for instance, in some of our substance abuse cases, the parent hasn't actually done anything, has not actually engaged in harmful behavior, but there is a concern about a risk of harm. So if you have a mother, let's say, that is addicted to opiates, that parent hasn't actually done anything physical or mental or sexual against the child, but the state is concerned that if the parent is parenting while under the influence of that opioid, that there is a risk of harm. And so we see this a lot. And that in and of itself, within a lot of our child protective cases, is enough for the state to become involved. And I think our parents, a lot of times they're like, well, I didn't do anything to my kid. I didn't do anything. I don't understand. And we have to spend a lot of time talking about it's not actual risk, it's risk of harm. And I think that's the problem with this broad category of neglect. A lot of these cases are not cases that involve actual harm, but the risk of harm to the children that are involved.
Right. So, Sonia, let's leave our audience with some tips that they can take away from this discussion that you and I have had. And one tip that I want to give to all of the fam that's listening is don't stick your head in the sand. If you are struggling with substance abuse or mental health concerns, make a plan. And this plan should include that you ensure that your children are safe and being cared for. And finally, get some help. So if you are a parent or a caregiver, make sure you follow that tip. Sonia?
Classie, I just wanted to piggyback off of that first tip, because I think that is so important. And that is a huge part of what we do when we are first connecting with our clients. We're talking about what is the plan, because we want to get kids out of the foster care / resource system as quickly as possible. And so if there is a family member or someone that you consider kin, because it doesn't have to be a blood relation, that is willing to assist you. And sometimes that means maybe moving into the home with a parent, or agreeing to supervise interaction with the parent, or allowing that parent to move into your home, whatever it may be, but have a plan. And I think connected to that is the notion, we've all heard the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child, particularly if you are involved in the child surveillance system. It takes a village. You need to identify your village. So to our practitioners out there, a second tip would be to help your client identify their village. Who's that family member? Who's that teacher, that friend, that church member, that mosque member, whoever it is that can come in and help undergird that family. And so that would be tip number 2.
And then our final tip is for our practitioners, our advocates listening in. Help your client overcome the shame and help them also identify their village. Like Sonia just said, the individuals that are going to be able to help the parent deal with the case that they are facing. They need to identify relatives, friends, church members, community members, whomever they trust and have a relationship with. Those are individuals that they can utilize for the purposes of resolving their case and even using those individuals as potential resources for their children, whether it be to serve as a foster parent, to serve as a supervisor for visits. But make sure you encourage parents and families to lean on their village. And finally, we want to tell you, if you have a tip, if you want to get engaged with us more, you have a question, you can reach out to us at torn with the letter C and then the word and, A-N-D, and then the letter S at gmail.com. That's torn with C and S at gmail.com. We want to hear from you. We appreciate you taking the time to listen to us, and we will talk with you again soon. Take care.
Take care.
The opinions and views expressed on this podcast are those of its hosts and guests and represent our own lived experience. The views and opinions expressed do not reflect those of any agency or organization with which we may be associated.